food is such a powerful tool for understanding how math and science and history and geography, literacy, even art apply to our day-to-day lives. And so many young people spend a lot of time in school asking why they're learning specific things and how they'll use them in their day-to-day life. And quite often, the answer to those things can be found in the kitchen and at the grocery store, and just all of the ways that we engage with food.
The curriculum is packed already, and we don't want teachers to feel like, oh, it's one more thing I have to squeeze in. But what we can do is stack the many curriculum expectations that we're trying to address. So today we're looking at procedural writing by looking at a recipe, which is procedural writing. It's a little bit of literacy. We were looking at the history of wheat. There's a red fife wheat that is Canadian in its content and origins, but bread itself goes way back into about 6,000 years. And just looking at the many different ways that food connects to the curriculum lets us really address the curriculum while doing this activity.
Food resonates with kids. They understand that it's something that they're constantly needing in their lives.
I've witnessed students who come into a class of mine, for example, feeling like they just don't have the knowledge or the ability, or don't know where to start. And then, after kind of talking about food systems from a systems perspective and understanding kind of where change can happen, I've seen them go out and get involved in an organization or a campaign or something that gives them much more hope, or much more of an ability to have an impact.
We need to be able to look critically at what is actually happening in our food system and see how we need to make some changes, because it's really not perfect. And it likely will never be perfect, but we really need to think about how one decision is having an impact on someone else somewhere else down the line. Children and youth are going to grow up to be the decision makers and the actors within food systems in the future.
The way we've been taught health since for at least the past few decades really kind of emphasizes that health equals thinness, which is something that sometimes actually brings more harm than good when we're thinking about health, and especially if we're thinking about young minds and the habits that can come out of it, the ways that body image can be shaped.
One of the most important skills to instill in students or in learners who are trying to understand the food system, I think has to come from an interdisciplinary approach. I work in the Department of Health Sciences, and I see students come through who could tell me everything about the nutrient breakdowns of a particular food item, but can tell me very little about where that food came from, how it was produced, what the workers were treated like, what kind of chemicals were used on it, how much profit was made off of it, and the list goes on. And, not that everyone needs to know everything about everything, but only in working together can we start to understand how things connect.
Learning about the way Indigenous people have cared for food for many, many generations is integral in learning about food systems in Canada. Indigenous food systems vary from place to place. So each community's food system is really determined by the community and the place that they have historically been. All communities have their own way of doing things and should be given the autonomy to really choose how to operate those food systems in a modern context. There's not a blanket approach to the way Indigenous folks approach food systems and food system work and food sovereignty in their communities.
Food justice is really important because it's useful for people to understand based on the privileges that they have and the communities that they live in, of what type of access to food that they have, and then how that differs from, even people down the street versus, or even people around the world, and what kind of food they have access to as well. So when we're thinking about food justice, we're talking about things like accessibility to land, but also to healthy food, and then also to culturally appropriate crops that originate from your culture, your ancestral lineage of what your grandparents ate and things like that.
Food is so relational in the land that we live in and how we take care of ourselves and literally where we are. And so even bringing things like that up when we're teaching about food systems and about health, and making it diverse and inclusive to the actual experiences of the people.
I think a good starting point is just to consider how much our individual food choices and preferences, they're so different from each other. And this is one of the things that makes food education so different than other subjects is it's so preferential, and it's so everyone has their own opinions on how they feel about the end product that we ultimately consume, which is really exciting. And I think that's an opportunity to bring in how diverse our food cultures, our food histories is being able to take that approach where it's okay to have these differences of opinion and different values.
Teachers should approach Indigenous food systems teaching and learning by involving Indigenous people, learning about each person's different experiences with food, learning about different communities, like learning about different resources happening all over Canada.
A lot of people actually their experience with food is from a completely different cultural perspective, and it could feel isolating when all the foods that are being talked about and all the meals that are being talked about are ones that actually aren't what your family would feed you or ones that you would learn how to cook.
Exposing children to different food cultures, flavors, and spices is so critical, because it's not just an Indigenous perspective. We want people to preserve their own heritage and their own and honor their own ancestors, bringing that stuff over, no matter where they come from in the world.
There's so much opportunity to bring in those perspectives and learn about other people and where they're coming from through the food that we're eating, because the food that we eat is such a common, relatable place. So it's a really powerful way to bring people into a position where they can get a glimpse of what it's like to be in someone else's shoes.
All of that knowledge is so essential and so important to understanding food and food systems. And we need to do a much better job at coming at these questions with these kind of different ways of knowing, and understand that they might not always they might not always make sense together. They might actually be in tension with each other, but that's okay.
Collaboration is such an important piece of the education of food systems. So how to have different actors figuring out how to work together, and even thinking about governments and how the Department of Health needs to work with the Department of Agriculture and start thinking about policies that mesh well together and accomplish a common goal of bringing healthy, sustainable foods to our plate.
Just starting somewhere. And tackling the education and the skill building piece one piece at a time, and recognizing that students will have a certain level of comfort and capacity for what they eat and how they choose to eat and the choices they make, recognizing that it's also our job as educators to try and fill in those gaps and expose them to more.
I think a lot of these topics are often framed in ways that feel that we have to become authorities in our own lives, when the process of eating and the process of sharing meals and the process of cooking are all things that actually elicit a lot of joy. And so kind of leaning into it from a place where we can take care of ourselves and where we remember that this is, at the end of the day, a fun experiment of flavors and ingredients and ways of doing things. I imagine it would help us feel a little bit less overwhelmed when we think of food in that way.
I think really what is a good place to start is just your own life and understanding your relationship with food. And then over time, thinking about, okay, where does this actually come from?
But that's just the starting point. We can begin with ourselves, but we have to be able to make those connections to other people in our communities, people across the country, people in Indigenous territories, and also the global food systems.
The skill building piece, everything experiential. I get out of textbooks, get kids out of their seats, get kids actually doing stuff with their hands, or going physically somewhere to see how our local food systems work.
It's a really good idea to bring in people who can support your teaching, people who are knowledge keepers. So especially if you're teaching about a culture that isn't yours, bring in someone who is a knowledge keeper from that culture and invite them into school. If you don't know a lot about growing, bring in a farmer or pair up with a farmer or a local master gardener. They're very knowledgeable folks, and they can do a skill share with you.
I think anyone in local food systems are very, very passionate people and want to share their journeys and what they do, and just reach out to them.
Model for your students that you can learn as well. Be honest with them, and modeling how to learn things is just such a great tool.
I think it's just important not to drive them towards coming to conclusions as much as to inspire them to enjoy the process of learning.
A willingness to experiment is missing a lot of the time. It will be messy, but that's okay. So is nature.